Here I have an aesthetic model of a remote control, and in this video I'll be covering how to create the base boundary surface for this remote. So I have a file set up with some images already brought in, but to simply set this up, all I had to do was add a couple sketch pictures in, one to the right plane and one to the top plane. And I'll be using these pictures to create the boundary surface. So the first thing I want to do is create a sketch on the right plane, and I'm going to go ahead and go normal to the plane. Now I'm going to create a simple line on both sides. And I want to make this the same size as the remote on both sides. And I'm doing this to set up reference planes which I'll use to create the profiles for starting off the boundary surface on both sides. So rather than creating reference planes to draw my sketches on, I tend to prefer to just create an extruded surface, especially when working with sketch pictures, as you can create these a lot faster. And now I'll be able to draw on both of those surfaces. Now I'm going to go ahead and sketch two ovals on each one of these surfaces. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the ellipse tool and then draw an ellipse in the center of this surface. Now I want to go ahead and make this coincident to the end of the surface. That's why we tried to make that line as close to the length of that side profile as possible. And then I'm going to go ahead and make this ellipse 1.5 inches wide. And that's based on the width of my other picture. So if you go in and measure that out, you'll get about 1.5 inches. I want to do the same on the other side. Once again, create an ellipse. And I'll make this coincident to both sides of this surface. Once again, I'll give this a width, and this will be about 1 inch wide. And to fully define this, I can just make these 2 points vertical, or I could have made the opposite points vertical. And then I'll go ahead and just make this vertical with the origin. So now that I have my sketches, I can go ahead and hide out the surface extrudes. And if I come into the surfacing tab, I could go ahead and try to create a boundary surface directly from this. Try to use some of the end conditions to get this profile right. But in the end, we're only going to be able to get so close to the actual profile. So we're going to go ahead and create guide curves, or direction 2, for that boundary surface. And I'm going to start with the right plane. So we're going to create a curve on both the top and the bottom of this image. So I'll go ahead and create a new sketch, grab that spline tool, and choose out both of these points. Now by default this is going to make this coincident to this line, but we want to go ahead and select out that point and the ellipse and just make these pierce so they sit at the top. So now that we have that spline placed in, we can go ahead and grab the spline handles and get this set to the right place. And on this side, we could experiment with making this horizontal. That's probably a little bit off. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that relation. And we can continue to just drag out these splines until we get this in the right place. And I can always add another spline point if I want, or I can move a sketch if necessary. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and leave it as is. If we wanted to get the back end to fit a little bit better, we could probably reduce the diameter of this ellipse slightly. Or we could just continue to play with those spline handles until we get this right. I want to go ahead and do the same on the bottom. And we can do this in two separate sketches or keep it in the same one. If we keep this in the same sketch, we'll just have to use the selection manager to select out the individual splines. But I like generally to create as few sketches as possible, so we'll create this in the same one. So on the bottom I can pretty much get this spline to fit just by dragging the single handle. But I could also modify this handle if I want as well. It probably has less of curvature problems if we do it this way. And once again, for this model I probably made this side of the sketch a little long. I could bring it in, but I'll go ahead and leave it as is. Now to get the correct profile on the sides, I want to draw a spline from one point to the other, which is, instead of being on a 2D plane, this would be in 3D. And we'd want it to follow both this outside curve as well as the curve in the center. That's a little bit difficult to freehand, so we can do this in a couple of ways. One is to create a projected curve on both sides. So we could create one sketch on the top plane and one sketch on the right plane and project that out. But typically if I need the same curve, we want the exact same geometry on both sides. So I typically create a spline on a surface based on an extruded surface that I create first. So on top of the right plane, I want to sketch out the center profile of this remote. So once again, this is sort of a guesstimate, but I want it to best fit almost the direct center of the remote. And then create an extruded surface. And I'll go ahead and just create this in one direction. And the reason for just creating it in a single direction is that once I create my spline on surface, I can trim down that surface and simply mirror this over. So I'll automatically have that curve on the other side. And I typically find this to be the easiest way to mirror out a 3D curve. So once again, we'll come into Sketch, create a 3D sketch. And now from the splines pull down, we can choose that spline on surface. And I'll go ahead and just drop it in, make sure it's on that surface. And I can make it coincident to both of these endpoints. So I can't quite see the sketch that I have underneath, so I want to go ahead and just hide out this surface body. And now I can come in normal to the top plane and modify this sketch as necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this out from this side first, and I can get this to follow the curvature of the remote. Because of perspective in the image, as well as how the remote's laid out, it's a little bit difficult to get the exact profile to show here. So we do have to do our best to sort of guess the curvature. But I would say that looks about right for what we want. So once again, I'm going to show that extruded surface and create a quick trim. And just keep the inside selection. Then I can go ahead and do a mirror. Choose bodies to mirror. And mirror this over the right plane. And that gives me all of the curves that I need to set this up. So now I'll go ahead and just hide out my original two sketches for the time being. And then create the boundary surface. So with a direction 2, typically these line up fairly well when you select out all of the edges. But when you do select a boundary surface or its directions, typically these are going to connect based on where you select. So if you don't have guide curves in place or direction 2s that you're going to use, typically you want to select out the sketches from the feature tree so that there's no bias towards where you select on the sketch. And sometimes you do have to move the connectors to get that set right. So now that we have that set up, we can choose our direction 2s out. If I select that upper spline, it's going to bring up the selection manager, because once again we did have multiple sketches or multiple splines in that same sketch. And for the sides, I can go ahead and just select out each of these edges. And to make this a little easier to see, I'm going to go ahead and drop in an appearance. And we can once again show those initial images, see how our profiles match up. You can see from this side it's quite good fit, and from the top it also looks to be a fairly good fit as well. And from here we could always continue working and building the rest of that remote control, making all the trims and additions necessary to get a completed part.